Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Black of Black Market Leadership. This is part two of my discussion with author Benjamin Runkle on his book, Generals in the Making.
This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Let's pivot to another general. Now, I'm not going to say this general's name. I'm going to tell you something about my work, and you can probably, I know you're going to tell me who it is. One of the cool things I get to do in my work is I get to behavioral profile leaders to help them identify their natural behaviors. I mean, they're how they act. Some people are loud, some people are like detailed, some people don't. But there's one behavior that's one major behavior called dominance, and that is the take charge trait. And dominants, when they're under stress, can become very irritable. They could be very domineering. They can be almost tyrannical. They can seem reckless. In fact, in terms of communication, dominants can ruffle people's feathers because it's not what they say, but it's how they say it. And I think you probably know I'm talking about Douglas MacArthur.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so reading your, so first of all, again, I've known MacArthur, but I was introduced to him through Tom Ricks, who did not have some very kind words for MacArthur, and then reading your writing on him, which is so fascinating. Here's a guy for the audience here. Here's a guy who has some really, really good ideas, but he came off so bad. He could rub people the wrong way that he would really sabotage his own efforts. And of course, I'm talking about his attempted innovations at West Point. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So if you, the thumbnail of MacArthur is absolutely, he was the most, hands down, the most intelligent officer of that generation. For whatever negative things you can say about him, he was clearly actually the book smartest of them all. He also was the most commanding. I talk in the book about, I think a little bit about how the ability to communicate is important, that being able to teach, being able to distill large ideas into simple concepts. And that's different, that kind of communication, from oration. And MacArthur was a great orator. But as the downside of it, he was also narcissistic and basically, as you said, domineering, that he couldn't think strategically in how to get things done, in a sense that he was so self-assured of his own correctness on everything that his tendency was to bulldoze in implementing ideas. So he comes back from the war, and for any critique one might have of MacArthur, he was genuinely a war hero in World War I. You know, went on raids with the infantry, small unit raids, etc. Perhaps arguably recklessly so. But he certainly showed extreme physical courage during the war. And he comes back as the most decorated officer in the war. And he gets asked by the then Chief of Staff, Peyton March, who had served under his father, Arthur MacArthur, in the Philippines. He gets asked by General March to go and take over as superintendent of West Point, which West Point was in complete and utter disarray in 1919. That they'd had to graduate essentially 3 classes in 1 year, because there was such a need for officers. It was disorganized as they were bringing classes back. They didn't have anybody. Much of West Point, the way it operated was that senior cadets would teach the younger cadets, but there were no longer any senior cadets. Moreover, the curriculum was hopelessly out of date. During the 19th century, West Point was arguably the single best engineering school in the country, and had much to do with the building of U.S. infrastructure in the 19th century. But it became too circular, too insular, that they became the warship because of the Civil War. That this was the institution that produced Grant, that produced Lee, that produced Jackson. That they tended to think they'd reached the pinnacle and there was no further need to innovate. And as a consequence, the education there had stagnated. It was completely technical. It was completely done by repetition, memorization and repetition, rather than actual thinking. And MacArthur, based on his experiences in the war, had seen this is not what the future of war is going to require of officers. We need officers who can relate to people, who understand things beyond engineering, beyond mathematics. And he goes to set about to just completely reform the curriculum, to reform the way they do discipline in the school so that it actually shows some trust and places some responsibility on the cadets. And another thing that I always found interesting, he placed a great emphasis on athletics, that he had seen that athletes were more respected by the men who made up the enlisted men in the Army, and also that those who had better stamina were able to make better decisions under duress. And he goes about trying to institute these reforms, and he was right on pretty much all of them, but because he was so self-certain, he never thought of the idea that he needed to bring the faculty along with him, especially the senior instructors who had been there for 30 years, the heads of the departments. And he ends up, it's almost a Greek tragedy that he, this brilliant Icarus-like figure soars too high and he's undone by his own hubris of not cultivating allies on the faculty who could help him to enact what were absolutely the correct reforms to do for there. And he ends up being, because of faculty complaints and alumni complaints, ends up being essentially relieved a year early, being shipped off to another assignment a year earlier than what he was supposed to have been done.
And if I remember right, the changes he proposed, it was just a fraction of them actually occurred, right? It wasn't until later on that he was still given, still labeled as the author of those, of that innovation at West Point. Am I right on that?
No, exactly that. His immediate successor was General Fred Sladen, who completely who completely went back and undid all his reforms. And then over the next 10 years or so, subsequent superintendents started to bring piece by piece back much of what MacArthur had been trying to do with his innovations, with his reforms, so that today, in 20 years, by World War II, it started to look like what MacArthur had intended. And today, I think it's Stephen Ambrose who makes the point in his history of West Point. He says, if Sylvan Thayer was who was superintendent in 1815 and made West Point the preeminent, academy and engineering school in the country, if he could be called the father of West Point, then he says, then the second most important figure is MacArthur. That much of what we see in modern West Point today, or of the last generation, and where it's, we have the respect for like the social sciences department, or we see it as a more well-rounded university, in addition to being the military academy. This was because of MacArthur, what MacArthur set in motion. And
it's really interesting that this conflict that he's in, trying to bring these reforms in, it really goes to not the essence, but there's no conflict in developing leaders, character versus intellect. And it seemed like West Point was so heavy intellect that he was doing his best to bring that whole character element into it. Willpower, like you said, even the physical stamina, the elements about that can inspire, to motivate, to actually bring quick change on the battlefield instead of just creating these deliberate plans. It's funny that you can still see these conflicts. I mean, through the centuries, thousands of years, I guess people have always had this argument, is it the mind or is it the body in terms of strategy or in terms of leadership? And there you see it at West Point. That was just a really, really fascinating chapter about MacArthur. I was really amazed at how smart he was, but at the end though, he had no time or no interest in the politics and literally of creating alliances. And boy, yeah.
Well, he would have what I think you would call today, he had very poor emotional intelligence, that he just couldn't put himself in anyone else's place to see how what he was doing would affect them and how they would therefore react to it. And that undermined it. He had the most brilliant ideas for innovation, but he was unsuccessful in implementing them because he was not able to. He could inspire in short term. There's I think an anecdote about where Jacob Devers, who would go on and be obviously a 4-star Army commander in the war, in World War II, but he's the head of the artillery detachment, and he describes how he goes in his first meeting with MacArthur and just how inspiring MacArthur was in the moment. But MacArthur had very few interactions like that. He tended to be very aloof, and he tended to be very standoffish towards anyone who opposed him or challenged his ideas, and therefore undermined. He brilliant ideas, but he would lose the war to win the battle, at least in the case of reforming West Point.
Yeah. How was he as a boss to Eisenhower?
That's one of the, I mean, he was terrible. He was basically what today, especially his time in the Philippines, but also you can see it a little bit when he was chief of staff in Washington. He was what nowadays would be described as a toxic leader, that he basically, rank has its privileges and was not very generous with regards to his subordinates. He, as I say, he would not let his subordinates move on to other assignments if he could still squeeze out value to them. And then in the Philippines, he worked half days. He came up with these plans that he was dishonest with his subordinates, Eisenhower and James Ord, as to what resources they had to work with, came up with incredibly unrealistic plans for what to do in building the Philippine army. And then when things went wrong, was very quick to throw Eisenhower and Ord under the bus. I mean, just there's example of how not to be a leader, his time in the Philippines. And Eisenhower recognized this, saw this, and was very desperate to get out of there with his career and his reputation intact, and was luckily able to do that.
I tell you, so let's pivot now to Eisenhower, because here's a guy, boy, I had no clue to the personal hardships he had post World War I. I believe his son Icky dies. He's also accused by I think it was a two-star general of being a liar about his pay vouchers, and this is on the record. Ultimately, he will later on work for MacArthur, just a toxic boss. And I just want the audience to realize, we know Eisenhower now, obviously President Eisenhower, and you know him as he's he became a 5-star general at the end, right? He was a 5-star. Yeah. And so you wrote this beautifully at the beginning of your book, and I'm gonna quote, although history seems to unfold in a straight line, reality is almost always more chaotic and uncertain. So for the audience here, when you see some of these great generals, you got to remember they just didn't pop up there with stars on them and become great. These guys were, they just went through some rough, depressing times. And if there's one guy who, at least in my view, just took a beating, it was Eisenhower. Can you give us a thumbnail of Eisenhower?
Eisenhower, I think, is the sort of everyman. I think he's the most relatable of all the World War II generals. That he sort of fell backwards into a military career. MacArthur and Patton, they were both had history of military service in their families. Marshall very early on makes a decision about wanting to do this. He sees troops coming home from the Philippines. His brother goes to VMI as well, and very much wants to do this. Eisenhower really only does this because he's a star athlete in Kansas in a day when there weren't a lot of athletic opportunities after high school for him. And so it's just a way for him to get a college education without paying for it and getting to play football, which is what he really loves to do. He wrecks his knee early on in his football career and almost doesn't get commissioned from West Point because of it. They make him swear never to try and be in the cavalry because his knees won't sustain the horse riding. And he's somewhat indifferent to the discipline there. But once he gets into a unit, his sort of innate talent as a leader starts to take over. And during World War I, to his disappointment, he can never get himself sent over to France because he's so talented at training, at communicating to people and to training other forces. So he gets stuck stateside, basically training all the tank forces that will go and serve under Patton in World War I. And after the war, he's afraid that he's going to be shunned because he was what they would call chairborne, or he was that he served at a desk more or less during the war rather than in the field. And you see this with a lot of the officers, Bradley, Ridgway, a lot of guys who never made it over have the fear that their careers are over in November 1918 because they weren't in the battlefields of France. So he finally, after going on the Intercontinental Convoy, after doing another temporary assignment too, finally he and Mamie are able to settle down because he hasn't seen her hardly over the last 3 years because he's been going from training camp to training camp he's being sent to places to train people deploying. They finally get to settle down at Camp Meade. Their next door neighbors are the Pattons, and the joy of his life is his 3-year-old son, Icky, who, if you see the pictures, this wonderful, angelic little blonde moppet. Eisenhower had a very cold father, very distant father who didn't show affection, and Eisenhower's absolutely the opposite. Loves playing with his little boy, showers him with affection, and then, yes, as you said, just out of nowhere, unfortunately, he gets typhoid fever and dies. It's a horrible way. It's 10 days where he can't be in the same room. Scarlet fever. Where he can't be in the same room with him until the end. All he can do is watch through a window as the center of his life, his 3-year-old son, is just decaying and falling away from him until at the end he's able to hold him in his arms as he expires. And it's just terrible. And then while he and Mamie are trying to adjust to the life without their son, trying to gain some sense of normalcy. I mean, that's a traumatic thing that most marriages don't survive. A lot of people never psychologically recover from that sort of traumatic event. As you said, he gets a notice saying, by the way, you're going to be court-martialed because you drew an allotment you weren't allowed to draw. Now, it was, by all accounts, it was an honest mistake of Eisenhower. There's nothing in his character and his history to ever suggest he would have done that on purpose. And it only came about, the only reason the Army knew was because he informed the Army. He was asked to testify in someone else's court-martial on the same thing and realizes, oh, wait a second, I did the same thing, and raises his hand and says, how can I pay this back? And an overzealous inspector general would rather drum him out of the Army than to just say, okay, write a check for $250. And so he gets rescued from this because one day he and Patton are best friends, are command sister battalions for tanks, and one day, a general officer that Patton knows comes to visit, and it's General Fox Connor, and he's about to take command in Panama. And Patton says, you should really meet this friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower. By then he was back down to Major Eisenhower. He says, he's very sharp. And so they take him to the motor pool. They explain what they're doing with tanks. And Eisenhower does most of the briefing. And Connor's so impressed, he demands that he wants him as his executive officer in Panama. The Army, the War Department says, we can't. He's about to be court-martialed. And Connor had been chief of operations for Pershing, basically walks over to the chief of staff's office and says, there's an officer who I think is being unfairly prosecuted. Can you look into it? And the person who, of course, looks into it is Marshall, and charges get dropped very quickly. The inspector general, seeing which way the wind is blowing, very quickly drops all charges and just they put a small letter of reprimand in his record. But just the struggle and trauma of that year that Eisenhower had, it's amazing that able to recover from that sort of thing. The resiliency and character it took to do that is amazing.
Yeah, for the audience, you go to a professional military school. You're going to West Point. The war comes, you don't get to go. Your son dies. You're about to be court-martialed, and I remember I think the general in charge of it literally wrote officially. Eisenhower is a liar.
He's either a fool. He says something to the effect of he's either a fool for not knowing the regulation or lying about it. It wasn't very generous to him.
No. I mean, if you dedicate your life to this profession and you just have all these events, I would have been like, oh, I'm done. I'm going out. I'm going to sell real estate or something, And the fact is, and
Eisenhower had opportunities. He had people that he had trained at Camp Colt. Some of them were businessmen that said, hey, come work for my company. You would be incredible as a plant manager, as running a division. In the early 1930s, during the height of the Depression, when he had been for a decade in the same rank, there were no promotions hardly in the interwar Army. He got offered a very well-paying position to be the military correspondent for the Hearst newspapers that he and Mamie talked about, and he decided not to. So he had opportunities to get out, profitable opportunities to leave the Army during the interwar period, and never availed himself of them. Thank goodness.
It's amazing. It really is. And I heard a quote yesterday. I don't remember where I heard it, But the quote was, and I'm sure you've heard this, for every Napoleon, there's 12 or 15 out there that haven't been uncovered yet. And what I mean is, Eisenhower, we were very lucky to have Eisenhower, but just think of I hate saying luck, but just the course of events, the fact that he stayed where he had all these but these lucrative opportunities that really, really could have helped him out. And the fact that he stayed that hard course. Wow. It's just amazing just how lucky we were to have him.
Well, even within that, there's a lot more luck to it. So George Patton, one of his heroes as a cavalryman, was the British General Sir Edmund Allenby. And in the Hawaii in the 1920s, Allenby comes for a visit, a tour, and Patton makes sure that he's the person who gets to escort him around. And he asks Patton, what's the key to making a great general? And Allenby says something similar to what you said, that for every Napoleon or Alexander that made history, there were several born. Only the lucky ones made it to the summit. Ernest May, I was a teaching assistant for the late historian Ernest May at Harvard, and in his book, suddenly drawing a blank on it, his book on the invasion of France, he says Germany got incredibly lucky that at one point the Germans, as they're plowing through Luxembourg, plowing through the Ardennes, they set up headquarters at a hotel. And that a boar's head, they take artillery fire, and the shaking of the room causes it's strange victory. That's it. That a boar's head that weighs about 300 pounds in the mounting comes inches away from falling on Heinz Guderian's head. And to say that, imagine the course of, if it had just been a few inches over, imagine what would have the difference in the invasion might have been. So one day out in late 1919, early 1920, Patton and Eisenhower, they're out experimenting with their tanks. They have this great idea. Let's see how many tanks, one of Patton's big tanks, let's see how many of Eisenhower's small tanks that they can produce, or vice versa, actually. But let's see how many how many smaller tanks can tow on a cable. And so they get it up to where it's trying to tow three smaller tanks. And you can hear the straining, then all of a sudden the steel cable snaps and comes whipping towards them. And it's cutting down trees like the knife through butter. And it comes about 6 inches away from their heads. That had it been another 6 inches, it likely would have decapitated the both of them. And the next that night, they're out on their porches talking. And finally, Eisenhower breaks it. He says, "Hey, George, were you as scared as I was?" And he's like, "Oh, that was yes." They had another incident where they were on the machine gun range and they were testing different machine gun properties to put on tanks. And suddenly the weapon jams, or they're not hitting the target. So they go down to look and make sure something's right with the targets. And somehow the machine gun accidentally cooks off rounds and starts firing at them while they're downrange. They have to duck for cover, maneuver their way, and wrench the ammo chain. And, they both admit that was stupid. They really needed to take all the ammo out. But that it, once again, just very lucky, a nice twist of fate that kept two incredibly important generals safe when very easily could have gone the other way. And there are other incidents with other generals as well during the war that, thank goodness. And you think about Eisenhower in 1938 nearly was in a plane crash while he's in the Philippines, and he's flying from one part of their archipelago to another archipelago, and they just very barely clear. The plane is having a problem, and very barely, only by inches, clears the ridgeline at the end of the airfield. A few months later, his best friend in the Philippines, James Ord, who he called the most brilliant general or officer of his generation. And if you see everything leading up to the Philippines, you'd say Ward quite clearly was going to be an important World War II general. Ord dies in a freak plane accident in the Philippines, where the Filipino pilot survives, and only because he was just in a wrong position, matter of inches, is killed. And therefore we never get to, otherwise we'd be talking about General James Ord, one of the great corps commanders of World War II.
Wow. For some reason, this is in my head. I hope I didn't just make this up, but wasn't there a story where Patton Patton and Eisenhower, weren't they trying to make booze and
Yeah.
exploded?
Yes. So, I think this is one of the great stories of American innovation. They come back. There's a great quote that when the American Expeditionary Force after the wars in the London Victory Parade, that Winston Churchill sees them and says, "Ah, what a fine body of men that'll unfortunately never be able to drink again," because prohibition had just been passed in America. But they were innovators. They like a lot of other people set up stills in their homes. Eisenhower made gin, Patton made beer, but they had no air conditioning or anything, so they had to store it in the shed outside of his house, very hot Maryland summer, and suddenly they start to hear explosions, and it sounds, bottles exploding inside the shed sounded like mortar shells, and Patton hits the deck, and his wife is making fun of him for it, saying, "Oh, my hero, my hero," but then she sees that Patton legitimately has a mask of fear on his face, that he has essentially, it wouldn't be diagnosed as such for, 70 years. The diagnosis wouldn't even exist until the 1970s, but he had essentially post-traumatic stress disorder, that he was having flashbacks to his severe wounding during the war, and he regains his composure, but exactly that this was, their follies, or not follies, but part of their life at Camp Meade.
Wow, that is. Again, I hope the audience is enjoying this, because these are the generals you see on TV leading these armies, but you had no clue to some of these. It's amazing. These I guess you call these near misses. They technically should be near hits. That's the old George Carlin line. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile.